It was the kind of night that whispered of unspoken horrors, where the darkness seemed almost palpable, clinging to the edges of the old highway like a malevolent presence. James, a seasoned truck driver who thought he had seen it all, found himself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter as he navigated the lonely stretch of road through the dense forest. The dashboard clock glowed 3 a.m., the witching hour, when the world held its breath, and even the wind seemed to whisper secrets. James's only company was the soft hum of the engine and the occasional static-laced tune from the old radio he hadn't bothered to replace. As miles stretched on, his eyelids grew heavy, the monotony of the road lulling him into a trance-like state. Suddenly, his headlights caught something moving at the edge of the forest. A figure, draped in white, staggered onto the road, arms outstretched as if reaching for salvation. James slammed on the brakes, heart racing as adrenaline surged through his veins. The truck screeched to a halt, mere inches from the mysterious figure. With breath held, James squinted through the rain-spattered windshield. It was a woman, her face hidden beneath a veil of long, matted hair, soaked from the night's drizzle. She looked up, her eyes catching the light, reflecting a deep, unsettling sorrow. Her mouth moved, but no sound came, only the relentless patter of rain filled the silence between them. Compelled by a mix of concern and unease, James opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air. "Are you all right?" he called out, his voice quivering slightly. As he approached, the woman backed away, her movements erratic, almost ghostly. "Please, I need help," she whispered, her voice a chilling blend of desperation and fear. The wind picked up, carrying her plea across the dark, empty fields that bordered the highway. James glanced around, the isolation of their location suddenly striking him with a visceral fear. "What happened?" "Are you hurt?" he asked, stopping a safe distance away. The woman shook her head, pointing towards the forest. "They're coming," she murmured, a note of hysteria in her voice. Before James could respond, a low growl echoed from the trees, a sound so primal and terrifying it rooted him to the spot. From the shadows emerged figures, not quite human, their features grotesque, twisted by malformations and the darkness that seemed to cling to them. James's blood turned cold, his initial urge to help the woman transforming into a primal instinct to flee. But it was too late, they were surrounded. The creatures advanced, their movements jerky and unnatural as if puppeteered by some unseen force. James backed towards his truck, eyes wide with horror. The woman's sad eyes met his, a silent apology, or perhaps a warning, passing between them. He made it to the cab, slamming the door shut and locking it in one fluid motion. Frantically, he started the engine, the old truck coughing to life as if protesting the sudden demand. The creatures were upon them now, thumping against the sides of the truck, their howls a terrifying cacophony that drowned out all hope. James slammed the gas pedal, the truck lurching forward, tires slipping on the wet road. He glanced in the rearview mirror, the woman's figure fading into the night, the creatures momentarily stalled by his escape. The road ahead was dark, unknown, and treacherous, and James knew he was far from safe. The night had more secrets to unveil, each mile potentially leading to greater horrors. But he had no choice but to drive on, the haunting image of the woman and the nightmarish creatures etched into his mind. As dawn approached, with the safety of daylight still hours away, James felt the weight of the night's terrors pressing down on him. He was alone, on a road less traveled, with no one to hear his screams should the darkness decide to claim him. And somewhere behind him, or perhaps ahead, the woman waited, a spectral sentinel in the tail of a night drive that had turned into a nightmare. But this was only the beginning, for the road was long, and the night was full of stories yet to be told. Continuing from where we left off, James drove on, his mind reeling from the encounter. The road before him seemed to stretch into infinity, each curve bringing him deeper into a labyrinth of darkness. He could not shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. Every rustle of the trees, every shift in the wind, felt like a whisper of impending doom. As the night wore on, the isolation became suffocating. James realized he hadn't passed another vehicle for hours. The sense of solitude was overwhelming, making every creak and groan of the old truck sound like a death knell. His only lifeline was the faint glow of the dashboard lights, casting ghostly shadows across the interior of the cab. His thoughts kept drifting back to the woman on the road. Who was she? What terror had driven her into the night, soaked and desperate? And what of the creatures that had emerged from the forest? Were they still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for a moment of weakness? Suddenly, his radio crackled to life. Static filled the cab, a harsh, grating noise that made James wince. He reached out to turn it off, but before his fingers could touch the dial, a voice cut through the white noise. It was faint, almost drowned out by the static, but unmistakably a child's voice, singing a slow, eerie lullaby. James's heart raced as he strained to make out the words. The voice was melancholic, filled with an unbearable sadness that seemed to seep into his bones. He felt a chill run down his spine as the singing continued, a haunting melody that spoke of loss and despair. The radio suddenly went silent, as abruptly as it had come to life. James sat in stunned silence, his breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. He looked around, half expecting to see the owner of the voice sitting beside him, but he was alone. Or so it seemed. As he continued to drive, the forest seemed to close in around him. The trees loomed taller, their branches clawing at the sky like the fingers of the damned. Fog began to roll in, thick and oppressive, reducing his visibility to a mere few feet. The headlights of the truck barely penetrated the gloom, casting eerie, dancing shadows that played tricks on his eyes. Without warning, a figure darted across the road ahead. James slammed on the brakes, his heart leaping into his throat. The truck skidded on the wet pavement, tires screeching in protest as he fought to maintain control. When it finally came to a stop, James peered out into the fog, his breath fogging up the windshield. There was nothing there. No sign of whatever had crossed his path. Had it been real, or was his mind playing tricks on him? He opened the door, the cold night air hitting him like a physical blow. The fog enveloped him, damp and chilling to the bone. "Hello," he called into the mist, his voice sounding small and fragile in the vast wilderness. No answer came, just the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He got back into the truck, locking the door behind him. As he pulled back onto the road, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone, that the fog had eyes, watching his every move. The road seemed to stretch on forever, an endless ribbon of asphalt winding through the heart of darkness. James's mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, each mile adding to the weight of dread that settled in his stomach. As he rounded a sharp bend, the headlights illuminated a sign, "Leaving Pine Hollow." A small sense of relief washed over him, the prospect of leaving the haunted forest behind offering a sliver of hope. But as he drove past the sign, a sudden, gut-wrenching realization struck him. He had passed that same sign hours ago. James's breath caught in his throat. How could that be? Had he been driving in circles, or had the road itself deceived him, bending reality to its will? He pressed on, the fuel gauge slowly ticking downward, a silent countdown to an inevitable conclusion. The night was far from over, and as the darkness deepened, so too did the horrors that awaited him on the road. And somewhere in the fog, the creatures watched, their time coming once again as the story of James's nightmarish drive continued to unfold, each turn in the road leading him deeper into a tale of terror without end. James pressed the accelerator deeper, the truck's engine groaning under the strain as the realization of his predicament sank in. The same sign, the same stretch of road, he was trapped in some hellish loop. Panic gripped him as he drove, his eyes darting frantically, searching for any landmark that might offer a clue to his escape. As the hours stretched on, the night showed no signs of yielding to day. The darkness remained as oppressive as ever, the fog thick and unyielding. The radio remained silent, the earlier interruption now seeming like a distant, surreal memory. Then, without warning, the engine sputtered. James looked at the fuel gauge, which he had been nervously watching decline, and realized with a sinking heart that it now hovered dangerously close to empty. He cursed under his breath, his mind racing for solutions. He slowed the truck, conserving what little fuel he had left, but the sense of being watched, of being followed, intensified. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he could almost feel the eyes upon him, hidden in the fog. Suddenly, a soft thump came from the back of the truck. James's heart skipped a beat. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, perhaps a shift of the cargo he carried, but the thump came again, louder this time, deliberate. He pulled the truck to a stop, his hands trembling as he reached for the flashlight in the glove compartment. Stepping out into the fog, James's breath came out in visible puffs, the cold air biting at his skin. The rear of the truck loomed up before him, a dark silhouette in the mist. The thump sounded again, from inside the truck. James's throat tightened, his mind racing with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. With a shaking hand, he unlocked the back of the truck, bracing himself for what he might find. As the door rolled up, the fog swirled into the cargo space, obscuring his view. James shone the flashlight into the darkness, the beam cutting through the mist. At first, he saw nothing but boxes and equipment. Then, as the fog settled, a figure emerged, crouched among the cargo. It was a child, a boy, no older than 10. His clothes were ragged, his face smeared with dirt. But it was his eyes that caught James's attention. They were wide with terror, shining with an unspoken horror. "Please, don't hurt me," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. James lowered the flashlight, it's been trembling slightly in his hand. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly, trying to sound reassuring. "What are you doing in here? How did you get in my truck?" The boy looked around, as if afraid of being overheard. "They put me here," he said finally, his voice a mere whisper. "The people in the woods." A chill ran down James's spine. "What people?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The boy didn't respond at first, then he said, "The ones who watch." Before James could ask more, a scream pierced the night, cutting through the fog like a knife. It was a scream of pure terror, coming from the direction of the road. James snapped his head around, flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. "Stay here," he told the boy, though every instinct screamed for him to climb into the truck and drive, fuel be damned. He made his way back to the front of the truck, the fog making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of him. The scream came again, closer this time, filled with panic and dread. James approached the source of the scream cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. As he rounded the front of the truck, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, in the middle of the road, stood the woman from before, the one who had first warned him of the creatures. She was not alone. Surrounding her were figures, half seen in the fog, their features twisted and unnatural. The woman met James's gaze, her eyes pleading. "Help us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. James took a step back, the flashlight's beam trembling in his grip. The figures began to move toward him, slow and deliberate. He knew then that the night was far from over, that his journey on this haunted road would lead him into deeper darkness, where the line between the living and the dead was blurred. And as the figures closed in, the fog swirling around them like a cloak, James realized that the true horror of the night was only just beginning. The road ahead was fraught with terrors yet unseen, each twist and turn revealing a new chapter of the nightmare that held him captive. James's terror surged as the figures converged. The eerie silence of the fog was broken only by their disjointed movements, a chorus of whispers and shuffling feet, as they encircled him. The truck, his temporary haven, seemed miles away now, an unreachable sanctuary across a gulf filled with fear. He held his breath, the flashlight's been flickering as his hands shook. The woman's plea echoed in his mind, a desperate, haunting refrain. She stood still, her expression one of sorrowful resignation, as if she had long accepted her fate but wished to spare James from the same grim destiny. The figures closed in, their forms more discernible now. Their faces, if they could be called that, were masks of torment, twisted by anguish and malice. Their eyes, hollow and unseeing, seemed to pierce through him, seen into the very depths of his soul. James took a step back, his mind racing. The child's words rang in his ears, the ones who watch. Was this what he meant? These creatures, were they guardians of this cursed road, or were they prisoners like the woman, bound to an endless night? With a sudden burst of determination, James swung the flashlight like a club, the beam cutting through the darkness and striking one of the figures. The impact was met with a hollow thud, and for a moment, the figure recoiled, its form shimmering like a disturbed shadow. Encouraged, James swung again, pushing through the circle of creatures, making his way toward the woman. As he reached her, she grabbed his arm, her grip icy and firm. "You must go," she hissed urgently, her voice low and trembling. Before they regather. "But what about you?" James demanded, his voice cracking with the strain of his fear. "I am already lost," she replied, her eyes filled with a deep, ineffable sadness. "But perhaps you can still escape. Take the boy, leave this place." James hesitated, torn between the urge to flee and the pull of his own conscience. Could he really leave this woman to her fate? As he wrestled with his decision, the creatures began to regroup, their forms becoming more solid, more threatening. With no time to lose, James nodded, understanding the gravity of her sacrifice. "I will find help," he vowed, though he knew the promise might be hollow. He turned and ran back to the truck, the fog seeming to part reluctantly before him. As he reached the truck, the boy was waiting, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "We have to go, now," James urged, pulling open the door and ushering the boy inside. As they climbed into the cab, the creatures surged forward, their mournful cries filling the air. James slammed the door shut, locking out the night and its horrors. He turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life with a reassuring growl. Pushing the truck into gear, James floored the accelerator, the vehicle lurching forward. They sped down the road, the creatures fading into the mist behind them. But even as they escaped, James knew the ordeal was far from over. The road stretched endlessly before them, shrouded in darkness and uncertainty. As they drove, the boy sat silently, his small body tensed for any sign of danger. James kept his eyes fixed on the road, his mind reeling from the night's terrors. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. Hours seemed to pass, yet the night remained as dark as ever, the dawn a distant, unattainable dream. The fuel gauge now hovered dangerously close to empty, a constant reminder of their precarious situation. Then, as if the night had not been fraught with enough horror, a new shape emerged from the fog ahead. It was a large, dilapidated structure, looming ominously by the roadside. A flickering sign read "Last Stop Gas and Diner," a beacon of hope or another trap set by the night. James slowed the truck, his decision weighing heavily. Should they risk stopping, possibly finding refuge or more danger? The boy looked at him, his eyes reflecting the same questions that haunted James. As they pulled into the parking lot, the engine sputtering with the last drops of fuel, the silence of the place was oppressive. The diner stood like a sentinel, its windows dark, its doors closed against the night. They had no choice but to stop, but the foreboding feeling that something was watching, waiting, did not leave James. With a deep breath, he killed the engine, the silence enveloping them like a suffocating blanket. They were safe for the moment, but as James looked out into the fog-shrouded night, he knew that their journey was far from over. The road held more secrets, more dangers, and their escape was but a brief respite in a night that seemed to stretch into eternity. As they sat in the muted silence of the truck, parked outside the eerily quiet diner, James's thoughts raced. The heaviness of the night pressed against the windows, a tangible reminder of the terror just beyond the glass. He glanced at the boy, who stared back, his eyes reflecting the haunting fear of all they had encountered. "We need to check if it's safe," James whispered, reaching for the door handle. The boy nodded silently, his agreement born from necessity rather than courage. Together, they stepped out into the chill of the night. The fog seemed to envelop them immediately, its cold fingers whispering across their skin. The diner's sign flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows that danced on the cracked pavement. James led the way, his footsteps cautious and measured as they approached the darkened building. As they reached the door, James paused, his hand hovering over the handle. He could feel the eyes upon him, the watchers hidden in the mist. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open, its creak echoing unnaturally in the silent night. The inside of the diner was cloaked in darkness, the only light coming from the occasional flicker of the neon sign outside. James fumbled along the wall, his fingers searching for a switch. With a click, the overhead light stuttered to life, revealing a scene untouched by time. The diner looked as though it had been abruptly abandoned, cups of coffee still half full, a newspaper spread open on a table. "They left in a hurry," the boy murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger or life. It was then that he noticed it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible. A soft humming, like a melody forgotten by time, emanating from the back of the diner. Motioning for the boy to stay put, James followed the sound, his heart pounding with each step. The kitchen door swung gently as he pushed it open, the humming growing louder, more distinct. There, in the dim light of the kitchen, stood a figure. A woman, her back turned to him, stood humming by the stove. The melody was haunting, filled with a sorrow that seemed to seep into the very walls of the diner. "Hello." James's voice was firm, but it trembled despite his efforts. The woman stopped humming, her body stiffening. Slowly, she turned to face him. It wasn't the face of a monster or a ghost, but of a middle-aged woman, her features marked with lines of grief and worry. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice cautious. "My name is James," he replied, introducing not only himself but the boy as well. "We're lost." "There are things on the road," the woman nodded, as if this was no surprise. "You're not the first to find refuge here," she said. "The road doesn't like to let go." "What is this place?" James asked, looking around the kitchen. "A limbo," she replied cryptically. "A pause in the journey." James processed her words, a chill running down his spine. The idea of being trapped here, in this forgotten diner, was almost as terrifying as the horrors outside. "We need to leave," he insisted. "We can't stay here." The woman looked at him, her eyes sad yet understanding. "You can try," she said softly. "But the road decides when you can leave, and it's not done with you yet." As they spoke, the lights flickered ominously, a reminder of the fragile sanctuary they had found. James knew they couldn't delay. They needed to make a move, to try and escape the night that sought to consume them. Returning to the boy, James explained they had to leave immediately. As they prepared to step back into the fog, the woman from the kitchen approached them. In her hand, she held a small, old flashlight. "Take this," she said, pressing it into James's hand. "It might help you see through the darkness." With a nod of thanks, James took the flashlight, its beam flickering but steady. Together, they stepped back outside, the diner door closing behind them with a soft, final click. The fog seemed to thicken, swirling around them as they made their way back to the truck. The road lay ahead, shrouded and unwelcoming, but they had no choice but to follow it, to see where it might lead next. As they drove away, the diner faded into the mist, a ghostly sentinel on a forgotten highway. The road stretched on, each turn and twist taking them deeper into the unknown. But with each mile, they carried with them a spark of hope, a flickering light against the enveloping dark. And so, the journey continued, the road unspooling like a dark ribbon before them, its end as mysterious and uncertain as the night itself. As the truck's tires hummed against the asphalt, James's grip on the steering wheel tightened, the old flashlight's beam dancing across the road ahead. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, a tangible force that threatened to swallow them whole. Beside him, the boy slept fitfully, his quiet breaths a stark contrast to the chaos of the night. The miles dragged on, each one seeming longer than the last. The fog began to thin, revealing glimpses of the landscape around them, gnarled trees like twisted sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. It felt as if they were moving through a different world, one untouched by time or sanity. Then, suddenly, the truck sputtered, its engine groaning in protest. James's heart sank as he glanced at the fuel gauge, it was empty. Despite their efforts at the diner, they hadn't escaped their fate. The truck coasted to a stop, its final momentum carrying them forward until all that remained was silence. James looked over at the boy, considering whether to wake him. He decided against it, letting him rest a little longer while he assessed their situation. He stepped out of the truck, the flashlight in his hand casting long shadows on the road. As he surveyed their surroundings, the silence was broken by a soft rustling sound. Turning quickly, James shone the light towards the noise. His breath caught in his throat as he saw them, figures emerging from the thinning fog, their movements slow and deliberate. They were surrounded. Realizing there was no escape, James backed towards the truck, his mind racing. The figures formed a semicircle around him, their faces hidden in the shadows, their intentions unreadable. "Who are you?" James demanded, his voice echoing in the stillness. One of the figures stepped forward, its features becoming clearer under the beam of the flashlight. It was the woman from the diner, her expression solemn. "You can't run from this road," she said softly. "It has claimed you, as it claims all who travel it without respect, without understanding." James's heart pounded in his chest. "What do you want from us?" "It's not about what we want," she replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "It's about what the road demands. Balance. You took something that wasn't yours to take." Confusion clouded James's thoughts. "We haven't taken anything." "Not yet," the woman corrected, stepping closer. "But the road knows. It knows all." The other figures began to close in, their forms blurring in the dim light. James realized that there was no arguing, no bargaining. The road had judged them, and its verdict was clear. As the figures surrounded him, the woman spoke one last time. "Find peace in the journey, James. For some, the road never ends." With that, the figures converged, and the darkness enveloped him. The flashlight flickered once, twice, then went out, leaving only the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. Back in the truck, the boy awoke with a start. He looked around, his eyes wide with fear. "James," he called out, but there was no answer. Stepping out of the truck, he looked around desperately, but there was no sign of James, no indication of the figures that had surrounded them. The road stretched out before him, empty and quiet. With nowhere else to go, the boy started walking, the sound of his footsteps the only proof he was still there, still part of this world. And so the road claimed another, its secrets kept, its balance maintained. For the road is old, older than memory, and it watches all who travel its path. Some find their way to the end, others wander forever, lost between the here and the now. In the distance, the first light of dawn began to break, casting long shadows across the road that never ends.